Welcome, dear listener, and thank you for joining us once again on this journey into the past. Tonight we turn to the 17th century, to the story of the early settlers in America, a tale where survival and hope, fear and desperation walked side by side. What if hundreds of men, women and children left everything they knew, crossing an unforgiving ocean, only to face famine, disease and conflict at every turn? From the swamps of Jamestown to the frozen winters of Plymouth, their struggle laid the fragile roots of a new nation. Stay with us until the end, because the answers hidden in their story are not as simple as they seem. And before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoy these historical journeys, and tell us in the comments what time it is where you are and from where you're listening. Now sit back, relax, and let us begin the story of the early settlers in 17th century America. The sea has always been both a barrier and a bridge, and in the early 17th century, it was the one trial no settler could escape. The crossing of the Atlantic was not a simple voyage of adventure. It was a test of survival long before Virginia's soil was ever touched. Picture it now. The year is 1606, and three ships, Susan Constant, Godspeed and Discovery, slip out of London's harbour, their timbers groaning under the weight of supplies, weapons and fragile dreams. The men who command them wear the Virginia Company's ambitions like armour. They have promised investors gold, trade and fertile land in the New World. But to the passengers crammed into the dark holds, the promises feel far away, dimmed by the claustrophobic stench of sickness and fear. The voyage is long, nearly 5 months, and every day presses down like a stone. Below deck, space is so tight that grown men cannot stand upright. They sleep on damp straw, shoulder to shoulder, their only companions the groan of the hull and the squeal of rats scurrying in the shadows. The air is thick with smoke from lanterns, the sour reek of vomit, and the musty dampness of the sea. Drinking water grows stale quickly, turning green with slime, while barrels of salted beef and pork rot faster than expected. Crawling with worms, hard biscuits, or hardtack are so solid with age and weevils that some men break their teeth trying to chew. A single barrel of fresh apples or onions becomes more precious than gold. On deck, the sailors curse the passengers as dead weight, ordering them to pump bilge water, haul ropes or clean the filth that accumulates in the cramped space below. The sharp divide between sailor and settler breeds tension. Arguments flare over food rations, over places to sleep, over who should labor and who should rest. Fists are thrown more than once, and blades sometimes flash before the captain intervenes. Yet quarrels, though dangerous, are the only outlet for fear. For all aboard know the truth. Storms are not the only enemy. Fever spreads quickly, and when one man coughs blood into his hands, the others shrink away, terrified of invisible death lurking in the air. And yet, not all is despair. At dawn, when the sea is calm, hymns rise from the deck as voices, weary but steadfast, sing psalms that echo over the waves. In those moments, hope feels tangible. Mothers clutch their children, whispering that the land ahead will offer food, freedom, and space to breathe. Young men boast of riches they will find, imagining fields filled with gold or rivers running with pearls. Dreams, as fragile as they are, keep spirits alive. Elizabeth, a young woman with her child pressed to her chest, hums a lullaby to soothe the infant's cries. Martha, whose husband already grows feverish in the hold, stares into the horizon, her face etched with a determination born of necessity, because turning back is no longer possible. Storms, however, remind them how thin the line is between hope and despair. Black clouds roll across the sky without warning, and winds howl like angry spirits. Waves rise higher than the masts, crashing against the hull with a force that threatens to splinter the timbers. Men lash themselves to the rigging, their hands raw from rope burns, while women and children cling to the nearest solid beam as water floods the deck. Barrels break loose and roll violently, crushing anyone too slow to move. Lightning splits the night sky, illuminating faces twisted in terror, as prayers and curses mingle with the shriek of the wind. More than once a man is swept overboard, his cries vanishing into the roar of the sea. No funeral is spoken. The ocean itself becomes his grave. John Smith, restless, sharp-eyed, and ambitious, observes everything. He records in his mind not just the suffering, but the character of the men around him. He sees who falters and who stands firm, who grumbles and who obeys, who offers a hand and who hoards the last crumbs of bread. To him, leadership is not about command, but about memory, the ability to recall who endured the fire of the sea and who let despair claim them. Later, when the colony teeters on collapse, it will be these memories he wields as both weapon and shield. But for now, he is only another passenger, bracing himself against the fury of the crossing. Time stretches in the monotony of the voyage. Days blur into weeks, weeks into months, until no one remembers how many times the sun has risen. Men carve dice from scraps of wood to gamble away the hours. Others swap tales of England's taverns and fields, longing for bread fresh from an oven or the cool shade of familiar forests. The younger boys watch the sailors with fascination, dreaming of lives at sea, though their mothers shake their heads and whisper that land is the only true home. Each man, woman and child clings to whatever fragment of normalcy they can salvage in the chaos of the Atlantic. And then, finally, the cry comes. Land. At first it is only a faint smudge on the horizon, a shadow that could be a cloud. But slowly, as the ships draw closer, the outline of trees becomes clear. Virginia, a world both promised and unknown. Tears erupt, mingling with sobs of relief. Men throw themselves to their knees, kissing the planks of the deck, thanking God for sparing them. Women weep openly. Children point in awe at the green expanse rising from the sea. After months of torment, the new world lies before them, silent, vast, and indifferent to the sufferings that have delivered them to its shores. They do not yet know that the hardships of the crossing will pale in comparison to what awaits them on land. They do not yet know of the hunger that will stalk them in the swamps of Jamestown, or the uneasy eyes of those who already call this land home. For now they know only this: the ocean has been crossed, the impossible endured, and the dream of a new beginning has survived the storm. At last, the cries of land had faded into awe. Before the weary eyes of the settlers stretched a coast of dense forests, tall pines rising like watchful sentinels against the sky, their branches whispering in the wind. The air smelled different here, rich with damp earth, wild blossoms and salt carried from the marshes. For men who had spent months breathing the stench of the ship's hold, this scent was almost intoxicating. Mothers lifted their children so they could see, pointing to the tree line as though it were a holy vision. For a moment, exhaustion gave way to relief. They had survived the ocean, and here was the world they had been promised. Yet beneath the surface of that joy lay unease. The silence of the land was not the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of being watched. Unseen eyes observed their ships, eyes that belonged to people who had lived here for centuries before a single English sail had ever kissed the horizon. The landing at what would become Jamestown began with trembling hands and aching bodies. Men staggered down the gangplanks, some falling to their knees to press their lips against the soil, whispering prayers of gratitude. Others stumbled to the tree line, to collapse in the shade, too weak to speak. John Smith, sharp-eyed as always, surveyed the land with both wonder and calculation. To him, this was no paradise. The ground was low and marshy, the water stagnant and brackish. Clouds of mosquitoes rose from the pools, biting with fever-laden fangs. But it was defensible, a narrow peninsula where a palisade could be raised and cannons mounted. For soldiers, strategy outweighed comfort, and so, despite the warnings of nature, this swampy tongue of land would become the first permanent English settlement in America. The work began immediately, because hesitation meant death. Trees were felled, their trunks dragged and sharpened into stakes to form a crude triangular fort. Every man was ordered to labor, though not every man obeyed. Among the settlers were gentlemen, men unused to bending their backs in toil, whose hands bore quills rather than calluses. They grumbled at the idea of digging trenches or hauling timber, believing such tasks beneath their station. Yet hunger has no respect for rank, and within weeks those same men would find their pride stripped away by necessity. Elizabeth and Martha, along with the few other women, did what they could, gathering water, tending fires, caring for the sick, but their numbers were too few to shoulder the full weight of survival. Each day was a battle against exhaustion, and each night the settlers collapsed onto the ground, lulled to sleep by the croak of frogs and the endless whine of insects. At first, spirits remained high. There were days when fish were pulled from the river, when wild berries sweetened the tongue, when venison was traded with neighboring tribes who approached cautiously in bark canoes. For a moment it seemed possible that the promises of England, the pamphlets that had painted Virginia as fertile and abundant, might hold some truth, but the land was not easily tamed. The soil, damp and salty, refused their wheat and barley. Wells dug into the earth filled only with brackish water that sickened those who drank it. Summer heat pressed down like a suffocating blanket, and mosquitoes carried fevers that left men shaking in their sleep, their skin damp with sweat. By autumn, death had already begun its slow harvest. Graves were dug at the edge of the settlement, shallow pits where bodies were laid without ceremony. Some men, weakened by fever, simply wandered into the forest and never returned. Mothers clutched their children tightly at night, fearful of the sickness that moved from hut to hut. The death toll grew so swiftly that one diarist later wrote, "Our men fell so fast that it seemed as if the grave did hunger for us." And yet, amidst this despair, the fort slowly took shape. Timber walls rose, cabins were built, and a tiny chapel stood at the heart of the settlement, its rough-hewn cross, a fragile symbol of order in a world that felt bent on chaos. The settlers were not alone, though their presence was not always welcomed. The Powhatan Confederacy, led by Chief Wahunsenacor, whom the English called Powhatan, watched carefully. This was his land, his people's land, and these pale strangers had arrived uninvited. At first, there were gestures of cautious peace. Corn and fish were traded, sometimes freely, sometimes begrudgingly. It was in these early encounters that a young girl, Pocahontas, made her first appearance in the English story. She was curious, bright, and brave, unafraid to step closer when others hung back. Her presence softened the tension, though she was only a child. Few realized then how important she would become in bridging worlds that seemed destined for collision. But peace was fragile, and mistrust grew quickly. To the English, the Powhatans seemed both generous and threatening, willing to share food, yet capable of vanishing into the forests to strike without warning. To the Powhatans, the English were unsettling guests, demanding, desperate, and always hungering for more land. Small skirmishes broke out, arrows loosed at the edges of the woods, musket shots cracking in reply. Fear drove the settlers to fortify their walls higher, to sleep with weapons at their sides, to mistrust every rustle in the night. The fort became not just a shelter, but a prison of their own making, locking them in against both the forest and their own anxieties. Inside those palisade walls, life became a relentless struggle. Food dwindled as the months dragged on. Rations shrank from loaves to crumbs, from meals to scraps. Horses, dogs, and even leather shoes were boiled for sustenance. Elizabeth, pale and gaunt, rocked her child with arms as thin as reeds, whispering prayers that tomorrow would bring food. Martha buried her husband in the frozen ground, her face expressionless, as grief had been dulled by exhaustion. Men argued bitterly over leadership, accusing one another of hoarding or cowardice. John Smith, rising above the chaos, imposed strict discipline, declaring that he that will not work shall not eat. His harshness bred resentment, yet without it, the colony might not have survived at all. And then came winter, the winter that settlers would later call the starving time. Its snow blanketed the fort, sealing them in with their hunger. Firewood was scarce, food scarcer still. By spring, only a fraction of those who had landed remained alive. Out of the original 104 settlers, barely 38 survived the first year. The land that had been promised as a paradise had revealed itself as a crucible, burning away illusions and leaving only the stark truth. Survival would demand more than courage. It would demand sacrifice, adaptation, and an endurance none of them had truly imagined when they first stepped aboard the ships in London. Yet even in this despair, a thread of resilience endured. When the sun rose after the long winter, when the rivers thawed and the forests bloomed again, those who remained picked up their tools and began again. They planted crops with trembling hands. They repaired the palisade. They rebuilt the chapel. They looked at the graves of their companions and whispered that their deaths would not be in vain. For though Jamestown had nearly perished in its infancy, it clung to life. And from this fragile beginning, history would grow. The winter had passed, but its scars remained. The graves outside the palisade at Jamestown were mute testimony to what the settlers had endured. Their markers crude, their names already fading from memory. Out of more than 100 souls who had set foot on Virginia's soil the year before, only a fraction remained. They were gaunt, hollow-eyed, their clothing torn, their strength worn to a thread, and yet they were alive, and in that fact lay the seed of something remarkable. Survival, no matter how costly, had not abandoned them. Now came the harder lesson, learning not merely to endure, but to live in this new land. Each morning began with the rhythm of necessity. Men rose from rough shelters, rubbing the stiffness from limbs battered by hunger and fever. Women gathered the few children who remained, instructing them to carry water, to collect firewood, to gather herbs. The colony's storehouses were nearly empty, and the fields still lay bare. For the settlers, every day began with a single thought: how will we eat? Corn, the sacred grain of the Powhatan people, became their lifeline. It grew tall and strong in soil that had mocked their European wheat and barley. Yet corn was not simply a crop. It was a teacher. Indigenous hands had cultivated it for centuries, pairing it with beans that climbed the stalks and squash that spread across the earth, keeping the soil moist and fertile. Slowly, painfully, the English began to learn this wisdom, not from books, but from those willing to show them. Among those who bridged this divide was a young woman named Anne Brant. Unlike many of her companions, she did not scorn the knowledge of the people who lived around them. She watched as native women pounded maize into flour, as they boiled herbs into medicine, as they used bark to cool fevers and leaves to close wounds. Anne, whose own husband had died in the starving time, devoted herself to observing, asking questions when she could, and copying what she saw with careful hands. When dysentery swept through the fort, it was she who brewed teas from raspberry leaves, soothing the bowels of the afflicted. When fever raged, she placed willow bark beneath tongues, its bitter taste masking a gift that lessened pain. Some settlers mocked her for consorting with the savages, but when her remedies saved lives, their whispers turned into reluctant gratitude. Anne Brant did not become famous. She did not write her name into the records of the Virginia Company, but in the fragile circle of Jamestown, she was remembered as the woman who kept death at bay when the stores were empty. Beyond Jamestown, Another story was taking shape. In 1620, more than a decade after the founding of Virginia, another ship set sail across the Atlantic, the Mayflower, carrying men and women who called themselves pilgrims. Their voyage was harsher still, their landing in Plymouth marked by bitter cold and rocky shores. William Bradford, one of their leaders, kept a careful diary, recording each trial, each loss, and each glimmer of hope. His words still echo through history. The icy winds that cut through clothing, the hunger that drove men to gnaw on roots, the graves dug into frozen earth, where half their company lay by spring. And yet Bradford also recorded the moments of grace, the help of the Wampanoag people, who showed them how to plant corn, how to catch fish in the rivers, how to live in harmony with a land that seemed determined to cast them out. Between Jamestown and Plymouth, a pattern emerged. The Europeans had brought tools, guns, and ambition, but without indigenous knowledge, they would have perished. Survival came not from conquest, but from humility, an acknowledgement, however reluctant, that they could not master this land without learning from those who already did. Yet this truth was fragile, and not all were willing to accept it. Many settlers clung to arrogance, insisting that their ways were superior, that their God had sent them to rule. It was this pride, more than hunger or fever, that threatened to undo them. For in truth, survival was never simple. Each harvest was uncertain. Each winter carried the threat of famine. The settlers lived in cycles of feast and famine, of abundance and scarcity, where one good crop might give hope, only for the next to fail and return them to despair. Tobacco, introduced by John Rolfe, began to change the rhythm of their lives. It grew well in Virginia's soil, filling the air with its pungent scent. It could not be eaten, yet it was food of another kind, the food of wealth. By trading tobacco across the ocean, the settlers could purchase supplies, weapons, and tools. But tobacco also carried a darker seed. To grow it in vast fields demanded labor, and labor demanded bodies. At first, those bodies were indentured servants, poor English men and women, who signed away years of their lives in exchange for passage. But before long, ships from Africa arrived, carrying human cargo, whose labor was stolen in chains. In the story of survival, the shadow of slavery crept quietly into the narrative, a shadow that would darken the colonies for centuries. Yet in the midst of these vast forces, it is the personal stories that remind us what survival meant. Elizabeth, once young and hopeful on the deck of the Susan Constant, grew thin with hardship, her hair streaked with grey before her time. But she clung to her child, whispering each night that tomorrow would be better, that they would not be forgotten. Martha, widowed so early, became a figure of resilience, trading with natives, bartering whatever she had for corn, refusing to bow to despair. And Brant, with her herbs and her healing, became a quiet savior. And in Plymouth, William Bradford's pen captured not just events, but emotions, fear, faith, and the stubborn courage to call a wilderness home. There were moments of quiet triumph too. The first harvests, when fields of corn rose tall and golden, when pumpkins glowed orange against the soil, when beans climbed their wooden poles in green spirals, the settlers gathered together, shared food with their indigenous neighbors, and gave thanks. In these moments, the weight of suffering seemed lighter, as though the land itself had decided to grant them mercy. Children laughed, women baked bread from new grains, and men laid down their muskets, if only for a day, to save a peace. These fragile celebrations became memories that endured, symbols of endurance that generations would later call the first Thanksgiving. But even in celebration, the settlers knew how thin the line was between life and death. One failed crop, one sickness, one misunderstanding with their neighbors could bring ruin. They lived not with certainty, but with vigilance, always watching the sky for signs of storm, the forest for signs of danger, their own bodies for signs of illness. This was survival, raw and unromantic, built not on triumph, but on endurance. And so, the settlements endured, from Jamestown's swamps to Plymouth's rocky shores, from Maryland's fertile fields to the growing towns of Massachusetts Bay. The story was the same: suffering, adaptation, and survival. Each year added new graves, but also new cabins, new families, new stories. And always in the shadows stood the memory of those first years, when survival was a question asked each morning and answered, sometimes, by nightfall. The first years in Virginia had been a trial by fire, hunger, fever, and the spectre of death had stalked the colony relentlessly, thinning its numbers until the graves outside the fort outnumbered the huts within it. Yet, by 1612, a new rhythm began to beat beneath the swampy soil of Jamestown. It was not the rhythm of corn or beans, though those remained the settlers' lifeline. It was the rhythm of a leaf, thin, green and pungent, the leaf of tobacco. The plant had grown here long before the English arrived, smoked in clay pipes by native peoples in rituals of peace, prayer, and healing. To them, it was sacred, but to the English, once its bitter smoke touched European tongues, it became something else entirely: a commodity, a currency, a lifeline. It was John Rolfe who first experimented with planting tobacco on Virginian soil. Rolfe had secured seeds from the Spanish colonies in the Caribbean, where the climate made the leaves strong and sweet. He planted them carefully along the cleared edges of Jamestown, tending them as though they were his children. By the summer, rows of green leaves shimmered in the humid sun, their scent clinging to the air like a promise. When the first harvest was dried, packed, and shipped back across the Atlantic, it caused a sensation in England. Merchants clamored for more. Smokers praised its flavor, and investors saw in the smoke the glitter of gold. At last, Virginia had found its treasure, not in mines or rivers, but in fields of tobacco. Tobacco changed everything. Where once settlers had struggled merely to feed themselves, now they saw a path to profit. Men who had nearly perished in the starving time began to dream of wealth. Land once chosen for defense or survival was now valued for its fertility, for the dark, rich soil that could yield leaf after leaf. Forests fell beneath axes, their towering pines and oaks reduced to stumps, making way for neat rows of tobacco. The rhythm of the colony shifted from hunting and gathering to planting, tending, harvesting, and shipping. Each man became not just a settler, but a farmer of tobacco, a servant of the leaf. Yet this new lifeline carried its own curse. Tobacco was greedy. It devoured the soil, leaving fields barren. After only a few years, farmers demanded more land, pushing beyond the fragile borders of Jamestown, cutting deeper into the territory of the Powhatan Confederacy. Every new acre planted was an acre taken, and every acre taken planted the seeds of war. Where the Powhatans saw the destruction of forests and the theft of hunting grounds, the settlers saw opportunity. Conflict, once a matter of skirmishes, now became a matter of survival for both sides. The more tobacco grew, the more peace shrank. Labor, too, became a question of survival. Tobacco was demanding, its planting and harvesting requiring endless hands. At first, those hands belonged to the settlers themselves, their bodies bent and blistered under the Virginian sun. But soon the colony's leaders looked to others, poor men and women in England, desperate for food or freedom, were lured with promises of land after 7 years of work. These indentured servants filled the ships crossing the Atlantic, their contracts binding them to toil in the fields. They dug, planted, harvested, and died in the furrows, their sweat soaking the soil that enriched others. Few survived their contracts. Disease, exhaustion, and brutality claimed many before their freedom was ever earned. And yet, even this was not enough. In 1619, a Dutch ship arrived at Jamestown, carrying 20 Africans. They had been stolen from Portuguese traders, their fate altered by the currents of war and commerce. The settlers purchased them, and though the legal framework was not yet fully defined, the pattern was clear. Here was a new source of labor, one that would not be bound by years of contract, but by chains of permanence. The Africans were set to work in the tobacco fields, and with their forced labor, a shadow fell across Virginia that would lengthen for centuries. The introduction of African slavery was quiet at first, almost unnoticed amid the noise of survival. Yet it was the birth of a system that would shape the very bones of America. Even as inequality deepened in the fields, the colony sought to grow in another way, through families. Until now, Virginia had been a colony of men, soldiers and laborers, their lives short, and their settlements fragile. Without women there could be no permanence, no homes, no children to inherit the soil. And so in 1620, ships arrived carrying what the company called tobacco brides. Young women, many of them poor, were offered passage to Virginia in exchange for marriage to settlers, their journey paid for with the very leaf that had transformed the colony. For each bride, the price was 150 pounds of tobacco. Men eagerly lined up to choose wives, not for romance, but for survival. For only with families could the colony take root. Elizabeth and Martha, who had endured so much in the early years, now saw other women arriving, their presence a sign that Jamestown was no longer a camp, but a community. But life was far from secure. The Virginia Company demanded profits, pressing the settlers to send more and more tobacco. Ships crossed the ocean, laden with barrels of leaf, and in return brought tools, clothing, livestock, and more people. Yet each ship also carried something else: expectation. Investors in London wanted returns, and governors were sent to enforce order. The colony was no longer a desperate outpost of survivors. It was becoming a business, and with business came rules, discipline, and punishment. Martial law hardened daily life, and those who disobeyed could face whippings, mutilations, or even death. The dream of freedom that had driven many across the sea now seemed bound by chains of another kind, the chains of profit. Still, the settlers endured, for tobacco gave them something that no famine, no fever, no war had ever granted: stability. With tobacco, ships came regularly. With tobacco, trade flourished. With tobacco, men dreamed of wealth, even if most never tasted it. For some, the dream was realized. Plantations grew, families prospered, fortunes were made. For others, tobacco brought only back-breaking labor, poverty, and death. Inequality widened with each harvest, creating a society where a few thrived, while many struggled. And beneath it all, the soil grew tired, forcing expansion, forcing conflict, forcing the settlers into a cycle of growth and violence that could not be broken. By the 1620s, Jamestown had changed beyond recognition. The crude fort was now a town, with streets, houses, a church, and fields stretching into the distance. New settlements rose along the James River, their smoke curling into the sky as ships docked with increasing regularity. What had once been a fragile experiment had become a colony, but at its heart lay tobacco, the crop that fed the colony's hunger for survival, but also its hunger for power. And with that hunger came chains. Chains on the soil, chains on the servants, chains on the Africans brought against their will. Tobacco was life, but it was also inequality, and in its leaves lay both the survival of Virginia and the shadow of centuries to come. The story of America's early settlers is not only written in the swampy soil of Virginia. Far to the north, on the cold and rocky shores of New England, Another group of weary travelers carved their destiny in the face of relentless winter. These were not adventurers in search of fortune like the tobacco planters of Jamestown. They were men and women who carried in their hearts a fire of faith. Pilgrims, they would later be called, driven not by gold but by the desperate need to worship God in the purity they believed was denied to them in England. Their story, no less than Virginia's, is one of hunger, fear, endurance, and fragile hope. It began in September 1620, when the Mayflower set sail from Plymouth, England, carrying 102 passengers and a crew of about 30. The ship was small, barely 100 feet long, and it was never meant to carry so many people across an ocean. Families crowded into the dark between decks, where low ceilings forced them to stoop, and the stench of sickness and seawater hung heavy in the air. Among them was William Bradford, a quiet but determined man, who would become their chronicler and governor. There was also William Brewster, their elder and spiritual leader, who carried with him the dream of a church free from corruption. Mothers tended children, fathers whispered prayers, and all aboard knew that their voyage was not simply a journey to another land, but a covenant with God. The crossing was brutal. Storms battered the ship, tossing it like a toy on the raging Atlantic. Waves crashed over the decks, drenching passengers in icy spray, while the wind howled through the rigging with a sound that seemed like the laughter of demons. One passenger, John Howland, was thrown overboard by a wave, only to grab hold of a trailing rope and be hauled back to safety, an escape that seemed almost miraculous. Others were not so fortunate. A boy named William Botton, the servant of Samuel Fuller, died before landfall, his body claimed by the sea. Yet even in the face of loss, the passengers clung to their faith, believing that suffering was the price of deliverance. After 66 days at sea, the Mayflower sighted land, not Virginia, their intended destination, but the rocky shores of Cape Cod. They had drifted north, pushed by storms and currents, and that patent from the Virginia Company was no longer valid. The wilderness before them was uncharted, unforgiving, and cold. Winter was already in the air, the trees bare, the ground hard with frost. It was here, in this moment of uncertainty, that the Pilgrims made a decision that would echo through history. They drafted an agreement, signed by 41 men, to govern themselves for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith. This document, the Mayflower Compact, was simple but revolutionary. It declared that their new society would be bound by laws made by the people themselves, not by kings or distant investors. It was, in its way, the first fragile step towards self-governance in America. Yet words on parchment could not feed empty bellies. The winter that followed was one of the harshest trials in colonial history. The Pilgrims had no proper shelter, only crude huts and the frozen deck of the Mayflower itself. Snow fell thick, winds cut like knives, and sickness spread with merciless speed. Pneumonia, scurvy, and hunger claimed life after life. At its worst, 2 or 3 died each day. By spring, only half of the original passengers remained alive. Mothers buried children, husbands buried wives, and when the earth grew too frozen to dig, they piled stones over the bodies to keep wolves at bay. William Bradford himself lost his wife, Dorothy, who drowned after falling from the ship into the icy harbor. His grief, though deep, was swallowed by the greater weight of survival. And then, as if guided by Providence, help arrived from the land itself. One cold March morning, a tall native man walked boldly into their camp and greeted them in English. His name was Samoset, a Wampanoag ally who had learned the language from English fishermen. His presence astonished the Pilgrims, who had expected hostility, but were instead met with a hand of peace. Through him came another man, Tisquantum, whom history remembers as Squanto. His story was tragic, captured years earlier by English traders, taken across the ocean, and then returned to find his entire Patuxet tribe wiped out by disease. Yet, out of his loss, he offered the Pilgrims life. Squanto taught them how to plant corn in the sandy soil, how to use fish as fertilizer, how to tap maple trees for sap, and how to find food in the forests and rivers. He became their guide, interpreter, and guardian, a man whose knowledge turned certain death into fragile hope. With Squanto's help, the Pilgrims forged an alliance with the Wampanoag chief Massasoit. It was a pact of mutual defense. The English would aid the Wampanoag against rival tribes, and in return, they would receive food and peace. For a time, this alliance held, and out of it came moments of joy amidst the sorrow. In the autumn of 1621, after their first successful harvest, the Pilgrims and Wampanoag shared a feast of corn, venison, and wild fowl. It was not yet called Thanksgiving, but it was remembered as a moment when survival gave way, however briefly, to celebration. But peace was fragile, and hunger always close. The years that followed brought new waves of settlers, some devout, others drawn by profit. Plymouth grew slowly, its cabins spreading outward, its fields widening into clearings. Churches were built, laws enforced, and disputes settled. William Bradford, as governor, wrote diligently in his journal, recording not just the events but the spirit of his people. He described their faith, their doubts, their quarrels, and their endurance. His words became a mirror of their soul, a reminder that history is not made only by battles and treaties, but by the daily struggle to live. Life in Plymouth was not easy. The soil was thin, the winters long, the harvests uncertain. Children grew up with hunger as a companion, and mothers bore more graves than cradles. Yet slowly, a community formed. Roads were cut, fences built, and schools opened to teach children to read the Bible. Each year, new ships arrived, carrying more souls willing to brave the wilderness for faith or fortune. And with each year, the fragile roots of Plymouth dug deeper into the stony ground of New England. By the 1630s, Plymouth was no longer alone. New colonies rose around it. Massachusetts Bay, settled by Puritans who sought not only survival, but dominance. Connecticut and Rhode Island, founded by those who sought greater freedom of conscience. Boston grew into a bustling town, its harbor crowded with ships, its streets echoing with the voices of merchants, ministers, and magistrates. The Pilgrims, once a small and desperate band, had become part of a growing patchwork of colonies, stretching along the coast. Their compact, their covenant, and their faith had carried them through the wilderness and into history. And yet, even in their triumph, shadows lingered. The alliance with the Wampanoag, though strong in its early years, would in time fray. Land hunger would drive settlers further into native territories. Disputes would sharpen, and the peace that Squanto had helped forge would prove fleeting. But in those early years, in the fragile dawn of Plymouth, survival was enough. Their story, like that of Jamestown, was written not in gold or glory, but in graves, in hunger, and in hope. The forests of Virginia, vast and shadowed, belonged not to the newcomers, but to those who had walked them for generations, long before the English cut down their first tree, before they built their triangular fort at Jamestown. These lands were home to the Powhatan Confederacy, thousands of people living in villages, spread across rivers and clearings, bound by kinship and allegiance to their paramount chief, Wahunsenacor, whom the English called Powhatan. To his people, he was more than a leader. He was the keeper of balance, the one who maintained harmony between the tribes and the land. When the first ships appeared on Virginia's shores in 1607, he watched with wary eyes. These pale-skinned strangers brought strange tools, thundering weapons, and a hunger that seemed to have no end. He offered them food at first, not out of weakness, but out of calculation. If they could be allies, they might strengthen his confederacy. If they proved to be enemies, then patience would give him time to learn their weaknesses. Among the settlers was John Smith, restless, ambitious, and as curious about Powhatan as Powhatan was about him. Smith quickly became the figurehead of Jamestown's survival, his stubborn will driving men to labor and his sharp words enforcing order. He also became the Englishman who ventured most boldly into the surrounding villages, seeking trade for corn when hunger gnawed at the colony. It was during one of these expeditions, in December 1607, that Smith was captured by Powhatan's warriors and brought before the chief himself. The Englishman's fate seemed sealed. He was forced to kneel, his head pressed against the ground, warriors ready to strike. And then, according to Smith's later account, a young girl intervened, Powhatan's daughter, Pocahontas. She was perhaps 11 or 12 years old, her name meaning the playful one. In Smith's story, she threw herself upon him, her arms shielding him from the club that would have ended his life. Whether the event happened exactly as he described, or whether it was a ritual misunderstood by Smith, remains debated. But what matters is this: Pocahontas became, in English memory, the savior of John Smith and the first bridge of peace between two worlds. From that moment, she moved between her father's people and the strangers at Jamestown, a child who carried the fragile possibility of understanding. For a time, this bridge held. Pocahontas visited the fort, sometimes bringing food, sometimes merely watching the settlers with curiosity. To the children of Jamestown, she was a symbol of wonder, a girl who appeared from the forest with gifts of maize and berries. To Smith, she was proof that peace with the Powhatans was possible, though he knew how fragile that peace remained. Powhatan himself continued to weigh the presence of the English carefully, providing corn in exchange for copper and beads, but always with suspicion. The settlers, hungry and greedy, wanted more than trade. They wanted land, and land was the heart of Powhatan's world. By 1609, tension erupted into open hostility. As Jamestown expanded and tobacco fields spread, Powhatan's patience thinned. Skirmishes flared, arrows and musket balls claiming lives on both sides. The winter that followed became known to the English as the starving time. Cut off from Powhatan's supplies, the settlers faced famines so severe that diaries later recorded acts of cannibalism. Out of 500 settlers, barely 60 survived. To the Powhatans, this suffering was proof that the land rejected the strangers. To the English, it was proof of their desperate need to dominate rather than depend. It was in the midst of this chaos that Pocahontas's life took a darker turn. In 1613, she was captured by the English during a skirmish on the Potomac River. Taken as a prisoner, she was used as leverage against her father, a pawn in the settlers' strategy. Yet captivity transformed her story in unexpected ways. During her time among the English, Pocahontas was instructed in their language and faith. She was baptized, given the name Rebecca, and soon after married John Rolfe, the tobacco planter, whose experiments had saved the colony economically. Their union was celebrated as a symbol of peace, a bond between nations sealed by marriage. For the English, it was propaganda, proof that their settlement could be more than conquest. For Pocah, it was a bitter compromise. His daughter was no longer his own, but she remained a tie, however fragile, to peace. In 1614, this union ushered in a period known as the Peace of Pocahontas. For several years, open conflict ceased, trade resumed, settlers expanded, and tobacco fields spread ever wider. Children were born into the colony, and for a brief moment it seemed as though coexistence might be possible. Pocahontas herself bore a son, Thomas Rolfe, and with him carried the hope of a new generation bound by two worlds. But peace was not destiny. In 1616, John Rolfe took Pocahontas to England. There she was paraded before nobles and courtiers as proof of the success of the Virginia experiment. She attended masques, dined with bishops, and was even presented to King James himself. To the English, she was the civilized Indian princess, living evidence that their mission was righteous. But behind the finery, Pocahontas carried sorrow. In London's damp air, far from her forests and rivers, she grew ill in March 1617. Preparing to return to Virginia, she collapsed and died, likely from pneumonia or tuberculosis. She was barely 21. Her body was buried in Gravesend, her son left to be raised among the English. Her death marked more than the end of a life. It marked the end of an illusion. The bridge she had embodied, fragile and miraculous, crumbled with her. After her passing, relations between the settlers and the Powhatans deteriorated rapidly. By 1622, war would again engulf Virginia as Powhatan's successor, Opechancanough, struck against the colony in a devastating attack. The peace of Pocahontas was over, and with it, the dream of harmony between the worlds. Yet her story endured. For centuries, Pocahontas was remembered, sometimes as a symbol of peace, sometimes as a tragic figure caught between two nations, sometimes as a myth twisted to serve the dreams of empire. But beneath the legends lies the truth of a young girl who once knelt in the forest to shield a man from death, who once carried food to starving strangers, who once gave her life to a people not her own. Her legacy was not only the fragile peace she created, but the reminder that history is written not only in battles and treaties, but in the courage of individuals who dared to stand between worlds. By the autumn of 1609, Jamestown stood at the edge of ruin. The small fort, once a fragile hope on Virginia's shores, now seemed more like a coffin waiting to be sealed. The settlers had endured disease, skirmishes, and hunger before, but nothing had prepared them for the storm that was about to descend. What followed would be remembered in whispers, in diaries inked with trembling hands, and in the graves dug shallow in the frozen ground. It would be called the starving time, and it would test the colony to the limits of human endurance. The disaster began with the absence of leadership. John Smith, the one figure who had held Jamestown together through discipline and sheer will, was gone. Injured in a gunpowder explosion, he had sailed back to England in October 1609, leaving behind a colony of 500 men, women, and children. Without him, order dissolved, factions formed, leaders quarreled, and decisions were delayed, while hunger sharpened its teeth. The fields yielded little, the summer crops had failed, and hunting parties returned empty-handed, harried by Powhatan's warriors, who no longer tolerated the English presence. The fragile trade with local tribes broke down entirely. Powhatan, weary of the settlers' demands, ordered his people to withdraw. Villages that had once offered corn now turned hostile, their warriors circling Jamestown like wolves. The fort became a prison, sealed against the world, its gates opening only for desperate raids. Inside, hunger became the true master. At first, the settlers rationed their dwindling supplies, salted pork, peas, and moldy grain, shipped from England months before. But as weeks passed, the storerooms emptied. Men scoured the forests for roots, herbs, and berries, anything that might quiet the gnawing in their bellies. They trapped rats, mice, and snakes, boiling them into thin stews. Dogs and horses, once companions and beasts of burden, were slaughtered and eaten. Leather shoes and belts were boiled until the hide softened, then chewed as food. Diaries speak of men digging for grass and acorns, their stomachs aching from the bitter, indigestible fare. By December, the fort echoed with coughs and groans, its people hollow-eyed and skeletal. And then, when hunger had stripped away dignity, darker acts were whispered. Archaeological evidence, discovered centuries later, revealed bones scarred with cuts, flesh carved from them. One account tells of a man who murdered his wife and salted her body for food before he was executed for the crime. Whether these horrors were common or rare, they haunt the story of Jamestown, a grim reminder of how thin the line is between civilization and desperation. The starving time was not only famine, it was a descent into the unthinkable. Winter sealed them in. Snow fell upon the palisade, muffling the sounds of the forest. But inside the fort, despair grew. Sickness spread through bodies already wasted by hunger. Dysentery, fever, and weakness claimed lives daily. Graves were dug shallow in the frozen earth, marked with crude wooden crosses, until the dead outnumbered the living. Mothers pressed their children to their chests, whispering lullabies, even as their own lips were blue with cold. Husbands buried wives, wives buried husbands, and when the ground grew too hard, corpses were left above, covered with stones. By February, the settlement was less a community and more a charnel house. When spring finally broke, the numbers told the horror clearly. Of the nearly 500 who had entered the winter, nearly 60 stumbled into the light of spring. They were shadows of themselves, their bodies wasted, their faces sunken, their eyes dulled by trauma. The Jamestown that survived was no longer the hopeful colony that had once set out to conquer the wilderness. It was a husk, a settlement clinging to life by a thread. But history did not permit its ending. In May 1610, new sails appeared on the horizon. The survivors staggered to the riverbank as ships entered the James, carrying fresh settlers and supplies. Among them was Lord Delaware, the new governor appointed by the Virginia Company. A stern man who brought not compassion, but discipline. He looked upon the ruins of Jamestown and saw not a tragedy, but a command: rebuild or be abandoned. The settlers, too weak to resist, obeyed. Lord Delaware imposed martial law. Work was enforced with the lash. Attendance at sermons was mandatory. Theft of food was punished by death. For the survivors of the starving time, these laws seemed cruel, but they brought order where chaos had reigned. Slowly the colony steadied. Fields were planted anew, palisades repaired, and the river once again filled with the sounds of boats and oars. The Virginia Company's dream had nearly died in the snows of 1610, but by sheer force of will and the iron discipline of its governors, Jamestown staggered back to life. And yet, the memory of that winter never left them. It lingered in the whispers told around fires, in the hollow stares of those who had seen too much, in the graves that lay just beyond the walls. The starving time became more than a season. It became a warning etched into the bones of the survivors, that survival in the new world was never guaranteed, that famine, war, and despair were as constant as the tides. But it also became a testament that even in the darkest hour, when death seemed inevitable and humanity faltered, Jamestown endured. From this horror, the colony emerged not stronger, but more determined. The lesson of the starving time was cruel, but it shaped the settlement's future. No longer would they rely on chance or generosity. Discipline, labor, and unyielding order became their creed. Jamestown had looked into the abyss and staggered back, and in its endurance, however fragile, lay the foundation of the English claim to America. The New World was not only a land of rivers and forests, of cornfields and tobacco leaves. It was also a land of invisible battles between faith and doubt, between superstition and reason, between the yearning for divine protection and the terror of unseen forces. For the settlers who built their fragile lives along the coast of Virginia and New England, the wilderness was alive with mystery. The cries of owls in the night, the flicker of strange lights in the swamps, the sickness that swept through villages without warning. These were not random events. To their eyes they were messages, signs, perhaps even punishments from God himself. Religion was the settlers' anchor. In Jamestown, in Plymouth, In Massachusetts Bay, the day began and ended with prayer. The Bible was not just a book, it was their guide to understanding the world. A poor harvest, a test of faith, a child falling ill, perhaps the Lord's discipline, or worse, the whisper of the devil. To them, the colonies were more than outposts of survival. They were covenants, holy experiments, cities upon a hill where the light of God was to shine into the wilderness. And yet, that very conviction carried a shadow, for the stronger the light of faith burned, the deeper the darkness of fear seemed to grow. Whispers of witchcraft traveled across the Atlantic with them, stitched into the fabric of their minds long before they set foot in the New World. In England, trials and accusations had already filled courts and villages, and now, in the forests of America, where every tree seemed to conceal secrets, suspicion thrived. If a cow fell ill without cause, if bread refused to rise, if a neighbor's glance felt too sharp, such small things could carry the weight of suspicion. The wilderness itself, vast and unknowable, seemed the perfect dwelling place for dark forces. And so, the settlers lived not only with hunger and war, but with the uneasy sense that unseen eyes, demonic or divine, watched them constantly. Yet alongside this fear, there was wonder. Superstition was not always a curse. It was also a form of explanation, a way of finding meaning in a world that offered little comfort. Women gathered herbs by moonlight, whispering prayers as they brewed teas to soothe fevers or ease childbirth. Children hung charms carved from wood or bone around their necks, believing they might ward off sickness. Farmers marked their fields with signs and symbols, hoping to keep pests at bay. To us, these acts may seem like fragments of folklore, but to the settlers, they were survival, as vital as plowing the soil or mending a roof. Stories circulated in whispers around the fire. A woman who dreamed of flames one night might wake to find her neighbor's barn burned down the next. A man who claimed to see strange figures at the edge of the woods was treated with both fear and fascination. Some settlers recorded visions of angels, of demons, of battles unseen, that gave them courage or dread. To believe was not optional. Belief was the air they breathed, and so, faith and fear became twin companions, shaping every choice, every judgment, every interpretation of daily life. In New England, the Puritans carried this faith to its most fervent heights. They sought to build not just towns, but holy communities, disciplined and pure, cleansed of corruption. Laws were shaped not only by kings, but by scripture. The Sabbath was sacred, and even the smallest acts of rebellion, skipping prayers, speaking carelessly of God, working when the bell tolled, could bring punishment. It was a society knit tightly together, bound by the conviction that God's eyes were always upon them. Yet in this tight weave, suspicion could spread like fire. One quarrel between neighbors might ignite into an accusation. One misfortune might be explained by the devil's hand. But let us not mistake this age only for one of dread. For in their churches, voices rose together in psalms that echoed through the air, filling the rough wooden walls with strength. Faith gave them courage when their crops failed, when storms battered their roofs, when graves multiplied. It was faith that kept them rising each morning, setting hands to plows and nets, believing that their labor was not in vain. And even in their fears, there was a strange beauty. The stories of witches and spirits, the charms and prayers, the visions and prophecies, they reveal not weakness, but the deep human need to find meaning in mystery. By the 1640s, as the colonies spread and towns took root, this dance of faith and fear became woven into the identity of New England and Virginia alike. Some settlers would look back and see superstition. Others would see the hand of God guiding them through peril. But all knew that survival was not only a matter of food and weapons, it was a matter of the spirit. Their greatest battles were fought not just with hunger or war, but with doubt, fear, and the unknown. In their prayers and their suspicions, in their psalms and their whispered stories of witches and spirits, the settlers gave birth to a culture that was at once devout, fearful, and endlessly fascinating. It was a world where every sickness was a lesson, every vision a warning, every misfortune a test, a world where God and the devil seemed to walk hand in hand through the forests of the New World. The uneasy peace that Pocahontas had embodied was gone. Her death in 1617 had left more than grief. It left a fracture, a silence where hope once stood. For a brief moment, after her marriage to John Rolfe, trade had flowed, fields had grown, and muskets had stayed silent. But peace in Virginia was never built on trust. It was built on fragile bargains, and bargains cannot last forever. By the early 1620s, the Powhatan Confederacy and the English settlers stood at the edge of a blade, and it was only a matter of time before blood fell upon the soil. The English colony was expanding. Tobacco, greedy and insatiable, demanded more land each year, devouring forests and pushing fences further into native hunting grounds. New settlements rose along the James River, Henricus, Newport News, scattered farms that crept into the wilderness. To the English, this was progress, the reward for their suffering. To the Powhatans, it was invasion, a slow theft of the very earth from beneath their feet. And while Chief Powhatan had once balanced diplomacy and caution, his successor, Opechancanough, carried no illusions. He was a man who had seen too much, who believed that survival now demanded not negotiation, but war. The strike came with silence. On the morning of March 22nd, 1622, settlers across Virginia rose to another ordinary day, tending fields, mending fences, sharing meals with neighbors. In some settlements, Powhatan warriors had even arrived earlier, greeting them as friends, trading food, smiling as if nothing had changed. But then, at the same hour, across dozens of settlements, the masks dropped, arrows flew, hatchets fell, fires lit the skies. In a single coordinated assault, Opechancanough unleashed fury upon the colonists. Farms burned, families were cut down in their fields. Men who had sat at tables with native guests moments before were slain without warning. By the day's end, 347 settlers lay dead, nearly 1/3 of Virginia's entire English population. It was not just an attack, it was a message. The Powhatans would no longer watch their land consumed. They would fight. Panic gripped the survivors. Jamestown itself, warned by a converted native servant who revealed the plan, was spared at the last moment. But the outlying farms and towns were shattered, reduced to ash and silence. Mothers wept over lost children. Husbands buried wives. Neighbors carried the wounded into the fort. Fear thickened the air like smoke, and anger soon followed. The English response was swift and merciless. Raiding parties stormed Powhatan villages, burning homes, cutting down cornfields, killing without distinction. The frontier became a wasteland of reprisals, a war of shadows fought in the forests, where every rustle of leaves might be an enemy drawing an arrow. For years the fighting ebbed and surged. Treaties were signed, only to be broken. Raids were launched, only to be answered with greater fury. The James River, once a lifeline of trade and hope, became a corridor of war. Settlers clung to their palisades, muskets ready, while Powhatan warriors melted in and out of the woods, striking swiftly before vanishing. Children grew up with the sound of gunfire and war cries as constant as the wind. The war scarred both sides, but in the long game, time was on the side of the settlers. Ships kept arriving, bringing more English families, more weapons, more supplies. The Powhatans, though fierce and determined, could not match the endless tide. Their cornfields, once the heart of their survival, were burned again and again by English raiders. Hunger spread through their villages as surely as it had once spread through Jamestown. The forests themselves became dangerous, stalked not only by wolves, but by soldiers who sought to break the Confederacy once and for all. In 1644, Opechancanough, now an old man, launched one final assault. Once more, hundreds of settlers were killed in surprise attacks. For a moment it seemed as if the Powhatans might again drive the English back into the sea, but the retaliation was swift, overwhelming, and final. The aging chief was captured, paraded as a prisoner, and soon executed. With his death, the resistance of the Powhatan Confederacy collapsed. The wars were over, but the cost was written in blood across the rivers and fields of Virginia. The Powhatan Wars were not only battles of muskets and arrows, they were the breaking of worlds. For the Powhatans, it was the shattering of their dominion, the loss of land, freedom, and the rhythm of life they had known for generations. For the English, it was the solidifying of their foothold, a brutal confirmation that they would remain, no matter the cost. The dream of coexistence, once symbolized by Pocahontas, was drowned in fire and blood. And yet, even in this devastation, history whispered of resilience. Survivors on both sides carried memories that would shape the next generations. Children of the settlers grew into men and women who had never known peace, only vigilance. Children of the Powhatans grew into witnesses of loss, yet held fast to their traditions, even as the forests shrank around them. The war had ended, but the echoes would never fade. For Virginia, the 1620s to 1640s were no longer the story of a fragile settlement clinging to life. They were the story of expansion through fire, of survival through conquest. The colony stood bloodied but unbroken, and in the ashes of the Powhatan villages, the settlers planted more tobacco, built more houses, raised more walls. The land was theirs now, or so they believed. But every harvest, every prayer, every laugh of a child in the colony carried a shadow, the memory of the wars, and the knowledge that survival in this new world had been bought at a terrible price. By the middle of the 17th century, the story of English America was no longer confined to the marshes of Virginia or the rocky soil of Plymouth. Across the Atlantic, word had spread of survival against impossible odds, of harvests drawn from stubborn earth, and of new lives built upon foreign shores. For some, these tales shimmered with promise, a chance at fortune, at freedom, at shaping communities untouched by the old world's corruption. For others, they sounded a warning, a land of hunger, war, and graves. Yet still the ships kept coming, and with every crossing, the map of English America grew more crowded, stitched with new names, new colonies, new dreams. The first of these new ventures was Maryland, founded in 1632 as a haven for English Catholics. In England, Catholics had long endured persecution, their churches dismantled, their priests hunted, their worship driven underground. Lord Baltimore, George Calvert, and after his death, his son Cecil sought to create a refuge across the sea, a place where Catholics might live openly. The charter granted by King Charles I carved out a vast tract of land north of Virginia, stretching along the Chesapeake. Here, in 1634, settlers landed and founded St. Mary's City. For a time, the colony seemed a fragile miracle, Protestants and Catholics living side by side, trading tobacco, raising families, and building a new society. To protect this balance, the Maryland Toleration Act of 1649 was passed, one of the first laws in the New World, to guarantee freedom of worship, for all Christians at least. Yet even this dream was fragile. Religious strife from England would bleed across the ocean, and Maryland would know its share of rebellion and conflict. Still, its very existence planted a seed, that America might be a land not only of survival, but of conscience. Further north, the harsher vision took root. In 1630, a fleet of 11 ships carried more than 1,000 Puritans to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, far surpassing the small band of Pilgrims who had landed a decade earlier at Plymouth. These Puritans did not come merely to survive. They came to build what their leader John Winthrop called a city upon a hill, a shining example of godly society for the world to see. Their arrival marked the beginning of what historians would call the Great Migration, a flood of Puritans fleeing persecution in England to create communities bound by faith, discipline, and order. Boston rose quickly, its harbor crowded with masts, its streets lined with timber houses, its church steeples piercing the sky. Schools were established, not for worldly knowledge, but to ensure children could read the Bible. Harvard College was founded in 1636 to train ministers, a testament to their belief that education was a pillar of faith. Yet Massachusetts was no refuge of freedom. The Puritans demanded conformity, punishing dissenters who strayed from their vision. Attendance at church was compulsory. Laws reached into every corner of life, from how one dressed to how one worshipped. Those who resisted were fined, whipped, or banished. But dissent has a way of sowing new beginnings. Roger Williams, a fiery minister, clashed with the Puritan leaders over their harsh rule and their treatment of native peoples. Banished from Massachusetts in 1636, he fled into the wilderness and founded Rhode Island, a colony built on principles of religious liberty and separation of church and state. Here, Baptists, Quakers, and even those without faith could live without fear of persecution. It was radical for its time, a fragile experiment that would echo centuries later in the very fabric of American identity. Alongside him, Anne Hutchinson, a woman whose bold teachings challenged male ministers, was likewise cast out and found refuge in these freer lands. Rhode Island became a gathering place for exiles, a patchwork of beliefs stitched together in defiance of Massachusetts' stern vision. Beyond Rhode Island, the fertile valleys of Connecticut drew settlers from Massachusetts, led by Thomas Hooker, who believed government should rest on the consent of the governed. In 1639, they drafted the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, sometimes called the first written constitution in the New World. It established laws not by royal decree, but by the will of the people, a radical notion whispered in taverns and fields, that power might spring from below rather than above. As colonies multiplied, so too did conflict. Boundaries overlapped, charters clashed, and the presence of Dutch and French settlers to the north and west added new layers of rivalry. Yet, within this tangle, trade flourished. Ships sailed back and forth across the Atlantic, carrying tobacco, fish, timber, and furs to England, returning with tools, cloth, and books. Boston became a hub of commerce, while Virginia's rivers glimmered with the wealth of tobacco exports. Newport's wharves bustled, and even small towns boasted taverns where news and rumors flowed as freely as ale. But beneath the surface, tensions brewed. The land that seemed so endless was never empty. It belonged to native peoples, whose patience grew thinner with every fence raised, every field cleared. Conflicts smoldered in New England, just as they had in Virginia, waiting for sparks to ignite. At the same time, inequality grew sharper. Wealthy planters expanded their estates, while indentured servants labored and died for promises rarely fulfilled. Africans, brought in increasing numbers, found their bondage hardened into permanence, and religion, that anchor of the colonies, became a double-edged sword, uniting some, dividing others, fueling both dreams of liberty and acts of repression. By the 1650s, English America had transformed, no longer a scattering of desperate outposts. It was a patchwork of societies, each with its own vision. Virginia, built on tobacco and discipline. Maryland, founded on fragile tolerance. Massachusetts, stern and godly. Rhode Island, defiant and free. Connecticut, governed by the will of its settlers. Together, they painted a picture of a new world that was both united and divided, full of promise and peril. The age of survival was not over, but it was giving way to something larger. The colonies were no longer only clinging to life. They were shaping identities, laws and futures, and in their growth lay both hope and shadow. The hope of new societies rising from the wilderness, and the shadow of conflict, inequality and ambition that would shape America for centuries to come. The colonies had grown. Virginia's tobacco fields stretched across the land where once only forest and river had stood. Massachusetts' towns buzzed with trade and psalms. Maryland's experiment in tolerance carried on, fragile but alive. To outward eyes, English America was thriving, but beneath the surface, cracks ran deep. With growth came inequality, with prosperity came division, and with ambition came chains. The story of the mid-17th century was not only one of towns and trade, it was the story of labor, of bondage, of rebellion, and of the cost paid for survival. In Virginia, tobacco remained king. But tobacco was a tyrant. Its hunger for labor was endless. At first, this demand was met by the poor of England. Indentured servants signed contracts. 7 years of toil in exchange for passage across the ocean. Ships filled with desperate souls, young men, widows, orphans, whose poverty made them easy prey for recruiters promising land and freedom. When they arrived, they found a harsher truth. Fields of tobacco demanded back-breaking labor under the sun. Their masters worked them relentlessly, often with lash and punishment. Disease claimed many before their contracts ended. For those who survived, freedom was often hollow. Land once promised was scarce, taken by the wealthy planters who controlled the rivers and the best soil. The servants, free at last, became wanderers, poor, landless, and resentful. But even as indentured servants struggled, another form of bondage was tightening its grip. In 1619, the first Africans had arrived in Virginia, their status ambiguous. Some were treated as servants who might eventually gain freedom, even own land. But by the mid-1600s, laws began to change. Blackness itself became a chain. In 1640, court records marked the first African sentenced to lifetime servitude. In the decades that followed, slavery hardened into law. Children inherited the status of their mother. Baptism could not free a slave. Escape was punished with brutal force. What had once been a shadow grew into an institution. Africans were no longer temporary laborers. They were property, bought and sold, bound for life. The transformation was gradual, but devastating. By the 1670s, shiploads of enslaved Africans arrived with increasing regularity, their lives traded for barrels of tobacco. Their voices, their songs, their memories of homelands carried across the ocean sank into the soil of Virginia. The colony grew rich, but its wealth was watered by suffering, and with each plantation built, with each chain fastened, the line between freedom and bondage deepened into a chasm. This inequality festered like an open wound. Wealthy planters, men who owned thousands of acres and commanded dozens of servants or slaves, sat in power, passing laws that favored themselves. Poor settlers, many former indentured servants, scraped by on the frontiers, fighting for scraps of land, clashing with native peoples, and resenting the arrogance of the elite. Anger smoldered in taverns, in fields, in the restless hearts of men who felt abandoned. All it needed was a spark. The spark came in 1676, in the figure of Nathaniel Bacon, a young, ambitious planter who arrived in Virginia hungry for land and power. Charismatic and restless, he gave voice to the frustrations of the frontier. When native raids struck outlying farms, Bacon demanded retaliation. Governor William Berkeley, cautious and tied to the interests of wealthy planters, refused. He preferred trade and treaties, not war. To the poor farmers, it seemed proof that the government cared nothing for their safety. To Bacon, it was an opportunity. He raised an army of disgruntled settlers, servants, freedmen, small farmers, and launched raids of his own against native villages. Blood spilled across the frontier, and soon the rebellion turned not only against the tribes, but against the colonial government itself. Jamestown trembled. Bacon's men stormed the town, demanding reforms. They burned houses, defied the governor, and for a time seized control of Virginia. In September of 1676, they set fire to Jamestown itself, flames devouring the wooden homes, the church, the very seat of authority. Smoke rose into the sky, carrying with it the fury of a class that felt unheard. For months, the colony was divided, rich against poor, governor against rebels, a society tearing itself apart. But rebellions rarely end in triumph. Bacon, fiery and bold, died suddenly of dysentery in October 1676. Without his leadership, the rebellion crumbled. Berkeley returned with loyalist forces, capturing rebels and executing them by the dozens. The charred remains of Jamestown were rebuilt, but the memory of fire lingered. The elite reasserted control, but the lesson was not forgotten. The colony had glimpsed the fury of the poor, the volatility of inequality, and it would not risk such chaos again. And so, a grim decision was made to prevent poor whites and enslaved Africans from uniting again in rebellion. The ruling class deepened the color line. They offered small privileges to white servants, land lighter punishments, a sense of superiority, while hardening slavery for Africans into a permanent hereditary system. Race became the dividing wall, ensuring that the poor would look downward in contempt rather than upward in rebellion. It was a choice that would shape America for centuries, inequality cemented not only by wealth, but by skin. The cost of growth was now clear. The colonies thrived, their fields and towns expanding, their ships filling harbors in England with tobacco, timber, and fish. But this prosperity was bought with chains, with blood, with fire. Indentured servants, slaves, and poor settlers all bore the weight of a society built for the few. Bacon's rebellion had revealed the cracks, but rather than mend them, the leaders built walls to keep them from breaking open again. By the end of the 17th century, English America was no longer a fragile experiment. It was an expanding system, fueled by labor, divided by class, scarred by rebellion. From Virginia's plantations to Boston's wharves, the colonies stood stronger than ever, but their strength came at a terrible price. The seeds of slavery had taken root. The divisions of race and wealth had been sharpened, and in the ashes of rebellion lay a truth the colonists could not escape. Survival had been achieved, but unity remained a dream deferred. 100 years had passed since the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery had first carried their weary passengers into the waters of Virginia. 100 years since men and women stepped trembling onto a swampy peninsula, raising their crude palisade against a wilderness they barely understood. 100 years since Plymouth's passengers stumbled from the Mayflower into the frozen silence of a New England winter, their breath rising like smoke as they prayed for survival. And what a century it had been. The early settlers had come to a land they believed empty, a canvas for their dreams. But the truth had been harsher, more complex. They had not entered a void, but a world already alive with nations, villages, and traditions. The Powhatan, the Wampanoag, the Narragansett, All had lived and thrived on these lands long before English sails cut the horizon. The first century of English America was therefore not just the story of settlers carving homes from wilderness, but of cultures colliding, of fragile peace shattered, of blood spilled across rivers and fields. The Powhatan Wars, the uneasy alliances, the betrayals, and the treaties all bore witness to the price of expansion. And yet the settlers endured. The starving time had merely erased Jamestown, leaving only 60 gaunt survivors to stagger into spring. Plymouth had buried half its people in its first year, the graves hidden beneath the snow to keep enemies from counting their dead. But from these ashes rose communities that refused to die. Their survival was not glorious. It was desperate, ragged, and often cruel, but it was survival nonetheless, and from it grew permanence. By the mid-1600s, the map of English America had changed. Virginia, once a fragile outpost, sprawled along the Chesapeake, its wealth measured in barrels of tobacco. Maryland had risen nearby, its experiment in religious tolerance flickering but alive. Further north, Massachusetts Bay spread outward from Boston, its Puritan steeples casting long shadows. Rhode Island stood defiantly independent, a refuge of conscience, while Connecticut's laws whispered of self-rule. The colonies were no longer scattered camps but a patchwork of societies, diverse, divided, and determined. But their growth carried shadows. Tobacco, the crop that had saved Virginia, had also demanded labor without end. At first, the poor of England filled the fields, their contracts binding them to years of servitude. But as the decades passed, slavery hardened into law. Africans, once a handful among the settlers, became chained laborers whose bondage was inherited by their children. By the century's end, slavery was no longer an exception. It was an institution. The prosperity of Virginia's planters, the gleaming streets of Boston's merchants, the very survival of the colonies, all were touched by the chains of men and women stolen from across the sea. The dream of freedom in the New World had been built upon bondage. The century had also been marked by faith. Faith that inspired courage. Faith that gave meaning. Faith that demanded obedience. The Pilgrims of Plymouth had written their compact beneath the swaying beams of the Mayflower. The Puritans of Massachusetts had carved their city upon a hill, stern and uncompromising. Roger Williams had raised the banner of religious liberty in Rhode Island, while Maryland's Catholics clung to their fragile toleration. Churches rose, psalms echoed, sermons thundered, but alongside faith walked fear, whispers of witchcraft, suspicion of neighbors, the belief that the devil stalked the forests. All reminded the colonists that the unseen world was as real to them as the soil beneath their feet. And then there was rebellion. Bacon's army of restless farmers and servants had set Jamestown ablaze in 1676, their anger a warning that inequality was a fire waiting for sparks. The rebellion failed, but its legacy endured. The ruling class turned to race as the dividing line, binding poor whites to their cause while condemning Africans to chains. The colonies had learned a cruel lesson. Order was maintained not by unity, but by division. By the year 1700, the English presence in America was no longer fragile. The colonies had survived famine, war, rebellion, and doubt. They had grown into societies with laws, markets, schools, and governments. Ships crossed the Atlantic in steady rhythm, carrying goods and people back and forth, tying the new world to the old. The dream of empire was no longer a hope. It was a reality. Yet the memory of the first century clung like smoke. Behind the prosperous plantations lay the graves of servants and slaves. Behind the sturdy churches lay the whispers of suspicion and fear. Behind every settlement lay the bones of those who had not survived. This was the legacy of the first 100 years, a legacy of endurance, ambition, and cruelty, a legacy where hope and despair had walked side by side. The settlers had come seeking freedom, yet built systems of bondage. They had come for faith, yet sowed fear. They had come for land, yet waged endless war against those who already called it home. And yet, for all their contradictions, they had endured against famine, disease, and overwhelming odds. The colonies had taken root, and in that endurance lay the foundations of what was yet to come. The 17th century closed not with triumph, but with a question. What kind of world would these colonies build in the centuries ahead? Would they remain fractured, clinging to survival, or would they forge unity out of their divisions? Would they honor the dream of freedom, or be chained forever to the legacy of inequality? The answers lay beyond the horizon, in wars yet to be fought, in revolutions yet to be born. But the story of America's first century was clear. It was a story not of ease, but of struggle, not of paradise, but of survival. And from that struggle, from that survival, a nation had begun to take shape. And so, dear listener, our journey comes to its end. We have walked together across a century of struggle and survival, from the fragile decks of the Mayflower and the storm-tossed ships to the swamps of Jamestown, from fields of tobacco and corn to the forests where treaties were broken and wars were fought. We have seen hunger and hope, faith and fear, cruelty and courage, and through it all, we have watched the fragile thread of endurance weave itself into the beginnings of a nation. The settlers who came to America in the 1600s could not have imagined what their small wooden forts and scattered farms would one day become. To them, each day was not a dream of empire, but a fight to survive until dawn. And yet, from their struggles came foundations of freedom, of law, of faith, and yes, of chains and division. They left behind not only graves and towns, but questions that still echo in the world we live in today. Perhaps that is the truest legacy of history. It does not end. It lingers. It shapes us, even as centuries pass. The whispers of Jamestown and Plymouth, of Powhatan and Pocahontas, of Bacon's flames and the psalms of Puritan steeples, they are not gone. They are threads in the tapestry we continue to weave. Thank you, dear listener, for staying with us through this long story of the early settlers. Your presence, your patience, your quiet attention have given life to these voices of the past. It is always a joy to know you return to spend these hours exploring history with us. Before we part, a gentle reminder. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe so that together we can continue bringing these journeys into the light. And we would love to hear from you. Tell us in the comments what time it is where you are and from what corner of the world you are listening tonight. Now let the story rest. Close your eyes. Let the noise of the present fade into silence. For though our tale of the 17th century has ended, there are countless more waiting to be told, waiting in the shadows of history to be brought back into voice. And so until we meet again in the next journey, may you drift into peace, into rest, into sleep. Good night.